The rancher did not move at first. He stood at the far end of the platform like an oak rooted in place, arms stiff at his sides, hat brim shadowing his eyes. But even from where she knelt with the child's hand in hers, the bride could feel the weight of his silence pressing against her. She had expected awkwardness, perhaps disappointment, she had always braced for that, but not this stillness that seemed more like a storm held in check. The girl squeezed her hand tighter, urging her forward, as though she could drag the woman across the distance her father refused to close. So she rose, brushing the dust from her skirts, and let the little one lead her step by step until she stood directly before him. For a long moment none of them spoke. The cattle hands in the distance laughed, a wagon wheel squealed, the station bell rang faintly, yet between the three of them, there was only breath and the sound of boots scuffing wood. Finally, he lifted his head. His eyes, steel gray with a shadow of sorrow, caught hers. She had seen many looks in men, hunger, dismissal, calculation, but never this. It was not disbelief nor disdain. It was raw fear, as though standing before her was harder than facing down a stampede or a gun barrel. "You came," he said at last, his voice low and gravelly, unused to words. "Yes," she answered simply, though her throat was tight. She wanted to say more, to tell him she feared no one wanted her, that she had prepared for rejection once again, but his little girl's fingers pressed into her palm, steadying her. The child looked up at her father, her chin jutting forward with brave determination. "Pa," she said, "this is her. This is my mama now." The words hit him like a blow. His jaw tightened, and for a moment he looked away toward the horizon, where the sun dipped behind the hills. The woman thought he might deny it, might send her back onto the coach with no more than a polite apology. Her heart braced for that familiar sting. But then he nodded slowly, a gesture so slight it might have gone unseen, except for the way his daughter sighed with relief and leaned against the bride's skirts. "You'll come," he said, not a question but a statement, as if it were decided. His hand gestured toward the waiting wagon hitched to two sturdy bays, dust rising from their hooves. She hesitated, glancing back at the stagecoach as if half expecting to be pulled back into its belly, as if someone would stop her and say she had made a mistake. But no one called her name. No one cared. Her life, she realized, had just shifted on that single whispered plea, "Can you be my mommy?" She lifted her case and followed him, the girl skipping lightly by her side. The ride from town was quiet, the wagon wheels rattling over rutted earth, the scent of sagebrush rising with each gust of wind. He did not speak, his gaze fixed forward, hands steady on the reins. She studied the lines of his profile, the sharp cheekbones weathered by sun, the mouth set firm not in cruelty but in restraint. He was a man who carried sorrow like a second skin. The girl, nestled between them on the bench, chattered softly, her small voice filling the silence with questions about the ranch, about whether the woman liked apple pie, about how she might braid her hair differently now that she had a mama to help. Each word made the bride's heart ache with a sweetness she had never known. When at last the ranch came into view, a stretch of fenced pasture, cattle grazing in the fading light, and a modest cabin crouched against the mountain's shadow, she drew in a breath. It was not grand, not the dream of romance painted in agency pamphlets, but it was alive. Smoke curled from the chimney. Horses shifted in the corral. The child clapped her hands. In delight. Home. He glanced at her then, just briefly, as if gauging her reaction. She met his eyes, and for the first time allowed a small smile to soften her lips. It wasn't much, but it seemed to ease something in him. When they arrived, he helped her down, his hand large, rough, enveloping hers for a fleeting second. The contact sent a strange warmth through her, not passion yet, but recognition, two souls long starved of belonging. Inside, the cabin was plain but clean, every item practical, every surface worn from use. There was a rocker by the hearth, a sturdy table, shelves lined with jars his late wife must have filled years ago. The silence of absence hung in the corners, but so too did the pulse of life, a child's scattered toys, the faint hum of a home that still breathed. The little girl tugged her toward the rocker. "Mama, sit here," she said, tugging insistently until the woman lowered herself into the chair. The child climbed into her lap as if she had always belonged there. The rancher watched from the doorway, his frame dark against the last spill of daylight. His face was unreadable, but his hands flexed once at his sides before he turned to light the lamp. The bride smoothed the girl's tangled hair, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She had thought no one wanted her. Yet here she was, in a stranger's cabin, with a child breathing softly against her, and a man whose silence spoke more than words. And for the first time in years, she felt wanted, not for beauty, not for dowry, not for false promises. Wanted because a little girl had dared whisper the truth her father could not: "Can you be my mommy?" Morning came with the cry of a rooster and the scent of wood smoke. She woke in the small bedroom set aside for her, startled at first to find herself beneath a roof not her own. For years she had lived in boarding houses, in rented corners, sometimes in the cramped lofts of strangers. But here, the quilt that covered her bore the faint scent of lavender, and the window opened onto hills streaked with dawn. It felt different, unsteady, unfamiliar, yet heavy with possibility. She dressed quickly, smoothing the wrinkles from her only good dress, and stepped into the main room. The rancher was already at the stove, sleeves rolled up, frying bacon in a cast-iron pan. He glanced up once, nodded, then returned to his task without a word. She hesitated in the doorway, unused to men who cooked for themselves, but before she could speak, the child burst in, hair flying loose, barefoot on the wooden floor. "Mama," she cried, flinging her arms around the woman's waist. The word still shocked her, yet it melted something hard inside her each time she heard it. "Good morning," she managed, bending to kiss the girl's crown. Her voice trembled, but the child beamed as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The rancher set plates on the table, motioning for them to sit. They ate in silence at first, the only sound the crackle of the fire and the scrape of forks. She studied him, this man who had summoned her yet spoke so little. His eyes seldom lifted from his plate, but when the child giggled or asked for more, a flicker of warmth crossed his face like sunlight breaking through clouds. When breakfast was done, he rose and reached for his hat. "Cattle need checking," he said simply. His voice carried the tone of habit, of work that waited regardless of who lived under his roof. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "I'll be back by sundown. You'll settle in." She nodded, though her chest tightened. Settle in, as though it were easy. As though she had ever belonged anywhere. The day stretched long, the silence of the cabin heavy without him. But the child filled it with laughter, showing her every corner of the home, the shelf where her dolls sat, the chicken coop out back, the tree where she liked to climb. By noon, the bride had rolled up her sleeves and found herself sweeping floors, hanging laundry, kneading dough. These simple tasks steadied her, they gave her hands purpose, and for the first time she felt her presence mattered. When she stepped into town later that week with the rancher and his daughter, things changed. The townsfolk stared, conversations hushed as she passed. She felt their eyes measuring her, not only as a mail-order bride but as a woman stepping into the shoes of the rancher's late wife. Whispers trailed behind her like dust on the wind. "That's her, doesn't look like much, poor thing, trying to fill Mary's place." She forced herself to keep her chin up, but shame burned her cheeks. Mary, the name hung in the air like a ghost. She had never asked, but now she knew, his wife, gone. She could see it in the townsfolk's pity, in the way they glanced at the child, in the way they looked at her with suspicion. No one said it outright, but the message was clear: she was not welcome, not yet. At the general store, she tried to pay for flour, but the shopkeeper hesitated, his eyes darting to the rancher as if waiting for approval. The rancher gave a curt nod, but his lips pressed thin. Outside, she touched his arm, hesitant. "I don't want to bring shame on you. If this isn't..." He stopped, his gaze sharp, the lines around his eyes deepening. "You're here," he said. "That's what matters." And then he turned away, helping his daughter into the wagon. That night, after the girl was asleep, the silence between them deepened. She sat by the fire, darning one of the child's stockings, while he mended tack with calloused fingers. The crackle of flames filled the space where words should have been. She longed to ask about Mary, about the sorrow that shadowed his every glance, but she feared opening a wound she could not mend. At last, she whispered, almost to herself, "I only ever wanted a place to belong." He looked up sharply, as though the words struck something raw within him. For a moment, she thought he might answer. His lips parted, his eyes softened. But then he turned back to his work, silent as ever. The ache in her chest was both sharp and sweet. She was wanted, at least by the little girl who clung to her skirts. That was enough for now. Yet in the quiet of that cabin, she could not shake the feeling that beneath his silence, the rancher's heart was racing, and not from fear of her, but from fear of what he might feel again. And as the fire burned low, she made a silent vow: she would not run from this place, not like all the others who had rejected her. If it took her last breath, she would prove she was not an intruder, not a shadow of another woman, but someone who belonged here, someone who could heal the silence of this house. The days began to settle into a rhythm. She found herself rising early, her hands learning the ways of this land, chopping wood, hanging laundry that snapped like flags in the wind, kneading bread while the child hummed at her feet. Each small duty stitched her more firmly into the life she had stepped into. But the silence of the rancher remained, thick and steady, like the mountains that loomed in the distance. He worked long hours, speaking little, his face carved by sun and loss. Yet it was the child who tied them together. Each evening when he returned, his daughter would rush into his arms, her laughter filling the cabin. And each night, she would crawl onto the bride's lap with a book or a doll, calling her mama as though the name had been waiting all along. At first, it startled her, made her feel like an imposter stepping into another woman's place. But soon the word took root in her chest, fragile but alive, like the first sprout in spring. One Sunday, the rancher announced they would go to church in town. She felt her stomach tighten. She had seen the way the townsfolk stared, the whispers that followed her. But she dressed carefully nonetheless, smoothing her best dress and braiding her hair with trembling hands. The child clapped when she emerged, declaring, "Mama looks pretty," and tugging her eagerly toward the wagon. The church bell rang as they arrived, its toll echoing over the fields. But when they stepped inside, silence swept the room. Heads turned, faces she didn't know sharpened with judgment. A woman in a fine hat leaned to her neighbor and whispered, not softly enough, "That's her." Brought in by post like a parcel. Her cheeks burned. She gripped the child's hand tightly, fighting the urge to flee. The rancher walked ahead, stiff and silent, guiding them into a pew. The preacher cleared his throat and began the sermon, but she could feel the stares pressing into her back, each one a reminder that she was an outsider. After service, as families gathered outside, the child darted to play with other children. For a moment, she thought perhaps she might be accepted. But then a voice cut through the air. "She'll never be Mary." The words were spoken by a tall man with gray in his beard and eyes sharp as flint. He stood with his arms crossed, staring straight at her. "Don't matter what dress you wear or how you smile. Mary was one of us. You're just passing through." A hush fell over the small crowd. She felt her throat close. The name again, Mary. The woman she had replaced but could never equal. She tried to speak, to defend herself, but her voice failed. Her hands trembled at her sides. And then, before she could answer, the rancher stepped forward. His hat brim cast a shadow over his eyes, but his voice carried low and strong. "That's enough, Elias," the man sneered. "You think you can bring in some stranger and call her your wife? You dishonor Mary's memory, and that little girl, she don't need some outsider confusing her." The bride flinched as though struck. Shame and sorrow swirled inside her. She turned toward the wagon, ready to retreat, to spare the rancher further scorn. But then, something unexpected happened. The rancher took her hand. It was the first time he had ever touched her in public, the first time his silence broke into action. His grip was firm, steady, as if anchoring her against the storm. "She is here because I asked her to be," he said, voice carrying enough force to still the murmurs. "She puts food on the table. She cares for my daughter. And she stands beside me. That's more than I can say for any of you who whisper like coyotes in the dark." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elias scowled, muttering, but no one else spoke. The rancher didn't let go of her hand until they climbed into the wagon. The child, sensing the tension but not understanding, nestled close between them, clutching her new doll. The ride home was quiet. She stared at the horizon, heart pounding, her palm still tingling where his had held it. At last, she whispered, "You didn't have to defend me." He kept his eyes on the reins, the horses trotting steady. "Yes, I did." His voice was rough, but there was no hesitation. "They don't see what I see." She swallowed hard, unsure if tears would spill. "And what do you see?" For a long time, he didn't answer. Then, softly, he said, "Someone who didn't turn her back. Someone strong enough to stay." The rest of the ride passed in silence, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was something else, something fragile, tentative, yet alive. That evening, when the child slept and the house glowed with lamplight, the bride found herself sitting by the fire again, her hands busy with sewing. He sat across from her, mending tack as always. But when their eyes met this time, neither looked away. Her chest ached with the weight of it, of all the things unsaid. The fear of not being enough, the grief of standing in Mary's shadow, the desperate hope that this might yet become a home. She wanted to tell him all of it, to spill her heart like water onto parched ground. But instead, she whispered the only truth she could manage. "Thank you." His jaw tightened, but his eyes softened. He gave the smallest of nods, then returned to his work. Yet the air between them had changed. The silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, full of things waiting to be spoken, full of the steady beat of two hearts that, against all odds, had begun to find their way toward one another.